You begin with a quiet assumption that what you know is reliable simply because it appears clear to you. You trust the coherence of your thoughts as if coherence were proof. This trust feels natural, and because it feels natural, you seldom examine it. Yet Al-Ghazali, whose entire inquiry begins with this very confidence, invites you to look closely at the structure beneath your certainty. He suggests that knowledge often carries the appearance of truth without guaranteeing it. You notice that you rarely question the foundations of what you believe. You assess the conclusion while ignoring the process that produced it. When this becomes evident, certainty loosens. What you called knowledge begins to resemble unexamined agreement with yourself. If what feels certain is unquestioned, is it certainty or habit? Al-Ghazali lived in an environment defined by intellectual ambition. Philosophers constructed systems of reasoning, theologians defended inherited doctrines, jurists built detailed frameworks of law, and mystics pursued inner illumination. Baghdad was a center of scholarship, and its scholars took pride in the rigor of their arguments. Within this environment, competing claims to truth were not signs of confusion but demonstrations of intellectual vitality. Al-Ghazali stood in the midst of this landscape, respected as a master of logic and debate, yet increasingly aware that each school insisted upon its own absolute certainty. If every voice is confident, what separates confidence from truth? Al-Ghazali eventually confronted a realization that reshaped his understanding of knowledge. He saw that every path he had trusted could be questioned. Sensory knowledge conflicted with itself. Rational knowledge required premises it could not prove. Authoritative knowledge relied on transmission rather than verification. Even the methods he used to evaluate ideas depended on assumptions that lay beyond examination. This recognition did not push him toward despair but toward a deeper question. How can a mind that doubts its own tools claim certainty about anything? You begin to recognize the weight of this question. The problem is not the conclusions you reach, but the reliability of the very process that reaches them. If the judge is uncertain, what value can its judgments hold? Reason presents itself as the most dependable faculty. It organizes, distinguishes, compares, and justifies. Its clarity feels solid, and its structure feels trustworthy. But Al-Ghazali observed that reason cannot validate the ground on which it stands. It can analyze propositions, but it cannot prove the basic principles that allow analysis to occur. You notice this when you examine assumptions such as the uniformity of nature or the reliability of inference. Reason uses these assumptions constantly, yet cannot establish them independently. It relies on them by necessity, not by proof. You also recognize a second limitation. Reason can show the consistency of an idea, but consistency does not equal truth. A system can be perfectly coherent and still fail to correspond to reality. This insight weakens the idea that rational clarity guarantees genuine understanding. When you see these limits, the authority of reason shifts. It remains useful but not ultimate. It operates within boundaries it cannot cross. If a tool cannot justify its own existence, can it justify anything built with it? Al-Ghazali teaches that the self does not approach knowledge neutrally. It arrives with preferences, fears, loyalties, and expectations. You begin to notice this within yourself. When someone challenges your belief, you defend it instinctively even before examining whether the challenge is valid. This reflexive defense reveals something deeper than mere attachment to ideas. It exposes the attachment to the image of being right. The self identifies its beliefs with its worth, so questioning a belief feels like threatening the one who holds it. This fusion distorts perception. Instead of examining evidence, the self evaluates threat. Instead of seeking truth, it seeks confirmation. Al-Ghazali's insight is that you cannot arrive at clarity while the self is invested in preserving its image. Real inquiry requires a willingness to let go of the comfort that belief provides. If the self depends on its beliefs to feel stable, can it ever allow those beliefs to change? Al-Ghazali recognized that most people adopt their beliefs long before they learn how to reason. These beliefs arise from family, society, and culture, forming a background that feels natural simply because it is familiar. You begin to trace the origins of your own convictions and discover that many of them were accepted before you ever questioned anything. What you considered personal reasoning often turns out to be inherited structure shaped by the environment in which you grew up. This realization is not an accusation. It is an invitation. It allows you to see how belief forms without your awareness. You notice how a belief becomes part of your identity, not because it has been proven, but because it has been repeated. You see how conviction can arise from repetition rather than examination. Al-Ghazali insists that inherited belief must be investigated, not rejected outright. Without investigation, you cannot determine whether you hold a belief because it is true or because it was given to you. When you observe this process, inherited belief becomes visible. And once visible, it is no longer absolute. If the foundations of belief were chosen for you, how can you claim ownership of the structure built upon them? For Al-Ghazali, the turning point begins when the mind observes itself without attempting to prove or defend anything. This observation is not emotional or intuitive. It is rational awareness directed toward the structure of thought itself. You start to watch your thoughts as they arise, noticing how quickly they claim authority. A thought appears, and you assume it has meaning. A belief asserts itself, and you assume it is justified. When you step back and simply watch, these assumptions become visible. The inner mirror is nothing mystical. It is the capacity of awareness to examine mental movement without submission. In this state, thoughts lose their automatic power. A belief that once felt unquestionable now appears as a claim awaiting validation. A judgment you previously accepted becomes a suggestion rather than a command. Al-Ghazali explains that clarity emerges not when the mind acquires more arguments, but when it sees its own tendencies. You begin to differentiate between what the mind produces and what the mind proves. This distinction undermines false certainty and creates the possibility of genuine understanding. If you can observe your thoughts as objects, what part of you performs the observing? Having seen the instability of inherited belief and the limitations of reason, Al-Ghazali turned toward a deeper question. Is there a form of certainty that does not depend on the shifting nature of thought? He recognized that reasoning is vulnerable because it is subject to doubt, revision, and reinterpretation. A conclusion reached today may be overturned tomorrow. A principle accepted now may be challenged later. Knowledge rooted solely in the intellect is therefore always provisional. You begin to understand this from your own experience. When you examine your beliefs, you notice that many were once considered final but later revealed as incomplete. This instability is not a failure of reasoning. It is a characteristic of the mind itself. Thought is active, fluid, and changing. Therefore, any truth dependent entirely on thought must share its instability. Al-Ghazali sought a form of clarity that is not threatened by intellectual fluctuation. He turned to a mode of awareness that does not rely on argument or inference. This is not anti-rational. It is simply recognition that certainty must rest on something beyond the process that continually changes. If certainty cannot come from what changes, can it arise from something that does not? For Al-Ghazali, The crisis did not end with the rejection of reason. It ended when reason accepted its rightful position. He understood that intellect is indispensable for analysis, interpretation, and self-examination. It is the instrument that reveals its own limits. But it is not the source of the ground upon which certainty must rest. You begin to see the implications of this shift. Instead of demanding that reason provide absolute certainty, you allow it to guide you toward clarity by dismantling false assumptions. Reason becomes a purifier rather than a creator of truth. It clears the mind of errors but does not generate the foundation of certainty itself. This repositioning transforms the entire inquiry. The battle between belief and logic dissolves because the demand placed upon logic was unreasonable from the start. You no longer require the mind to prove what lies beyond its scope. Instead, you allow the mind to reach a point where it recognizes its limits. At this moment, something subtle occurs. Reason ceases to struggle. It no longer tries to establish itself as the ultimate authority. It simply functions as it is meant to function, as a tool that points toward clarity but does not claim to own it. If the intellect functions best when it knows its limits, why does it so often attempt to exceed them? Here, the inquiry arrives at a quiet turning. You recognize that truth is not something the mind captures, but something it becomes aware of when it stops insisting on possession. Al-Ghazali describes certainty not as a conclusion but as a condition in which the struggle for control dissolves. When the mind recognizes its boundaries, it no longer attempts to dominate understanding. It simply becomes receptive. In this receptivity, the search loses its tension. Inquiry continues, but without the demand for absolute comprehension. What remains is clarity that does not depend on argument. If truth reveals itself only when the mind becomes quiet, who is the one that receives what the mind no longer claims?